It's that time again, time for another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Andrea Letamendi. Hello, Andrea.
Hello, Gotham girls and Gotham boys.
And Gotham men and Gotham women. They can be
grown-ups. And everyone in between. This is a spectrum, after all.
That is true. Spectrums. We should talk about spectrums. We're going to talk about spectrums this week, right?
We will. We will definitely talk about spectrums this week.
Very cool. Very excited about this episode because this episode gives us an opportunity to go back to one of our former villains, someone we don't get to see a lot, someone we thought could be dead at the end of the last episode we saw them in. Although Batman...
I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about The Walking Dead for a second.
No, not yet. We'll talk about that later. That's a different show. But Batman speculated that he didn't think that particular character had died. Maybe that was just wishful thinking on his part because he's Batman. Mm-hmm. But it turns out he was right because we're going to jump right into it. We're doing Time Out of Joint this week. And this one was written by Steve Perry from a story by Alan Burnett, and it was directed by Dan Riba. Now, this one, if you're following along, watching on Amazon Prime or on the Batman the Animated Series Volume 3 or the complete series set, you'll notice that the opening title's completely different.
Yes.
For this one. That's because they decided this one is now one of those episodes that introduces the adventures of Batman and Robin.
Right. So the whole intro is a montage, if you will, of Batman and Robin, of scenes where Robin is assisting and beside Batman during all these adventures. And so the idea, I guess, I don't recall this transition when I was watching this as a kid. But I imagine that this was a very deliberate decision to include Dick Grayson, Boy Wonder, as a part of this duo. That this is going to be a Batman and Robin show.
Yeah, I think ultimately the producers, the writers, the directors, the gang who put the show together probably came to the same conclusion we did, which is that Batman really dislikes people. And one of those people that gets the brunt of his dislike is maybe Robin. So they're going to force it on him to deal with Robin a whole lot more from here on out.
No, I think that they established that kids want to watch Batman and Robin work together. And so that's why they wanted to create that show, or at least give the pairing a more, showcase the pairing more than just Batman alone. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's discuss this because we've not seen anything that would answer this question yet. And that is our rule. That's our general rule, is we're not allowed to discuss anything we know happens in the future. We can only discuss what we just watched and what we have seen leading up to this point. So I don't know that we can answer this, but if Robin is going to be a whole lot more involved now, that means one of three things. He's either on hiatus from school, like maybe it's during an extended break or something. Maybe he dropped out of school, or maybe he graduated from school. Do we know?
In the first few episodes that we've seen him, he's in college.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it could be that he's still taking courses, but in the evenings just in the same way Bruce Wayne is, at the Wayne Tower doing business. You can imagine that Robin can take a few courses here and there.
Yeah. I imagine Robin's class load must be getting more and more difficult. That or more, now he's just taking like leather work classes or
beekeeping.
Yeah, something along those lines. Something where he doesn't have to necessarily be awake during class. That or his grades are slipping, or he's on the 6 or 7 year.
He's also very, very bright.
He's very bright.
It could be that he doesn't need to sit in class.
I'll take it.
But I've noticed that he was there when we covered House and Garden, when we covered Harlequinade. He's been around. So.
Well, and apparently I did some research because unlike you, when I watched these as a kid, I didn't necessarily watch them all. So, and certainly by this point, I think it's safe to say we are embedded in a number of the episodes that I have never seen before up to this point. So I'm watching these mostly, fresh. You have seen all of these, and whether or not you remember them as being specifically part of the Adventures of Batman and Robin, is something else. But you've seen these episodes. Apparently, several of the episodes that we've just got done covering were technically part of this run.
You're saying the Batman and Robin run.
Right.
Yeah.
They have been put back in the proper order on the DVD box sets, and then when they were released on VHS, when they were released in subsequent airings on Fox and all of that. But apparently, some of those episodes that we've just covered were part of the Adventures of Batman and Robin. And I could be getting that incorrect, but I tried to do a little bit of research on why we're seeing new opening title sequences and closing credit sequences.
And the music's different.
Yeah, a little bit different, and that's what they said. So that explains why we're seeing a lot more of Robin.
Right.
Maybe those episodes that didn't have those title changes and music changes and a little bit of design change. Maybe those episodes were Robin trying to decide if he should drop out of college, and then he finally did, and they went ahead and gave him, top billing with Batman. Who knows?
Good for him.
Yeah, he made an important life decision. Drea, this week we are going to revisit an old villain, and that is the Clock King, Temple Fugit. If you remember the last time we saw him, he was up in a clock tower, and he and Batman were fighting in a very sort of swashbuckling, sword fighty kind of manner. And the Clock King ends up plummeting to what we believe is his death. Batman.
Oh, that's right. The whole tower went down.
Yeah, and Batman predicts that we'll see him again. And it turns out that he was absolutely right, because now, quite some time later, we revisit Mr. Fugit, and he is now basically committing robberies with this little device that looks eerily like a Super Nintendo remote control strapped to his belt, and it basically gives him the ability to suspend time around him while he is going super fast, and doing things.
Right. And it's the beginning of this episode is a little mysterious because you see him disappear while highly valued objects suddenly disappear as well.
Yeah.
At first I thought that he was able to transport or something, and then I thought it was more of a time freezing element, that it was kind of like Out of This World. If you remember that show,
Out of This World.
yeah.
Oh yeah, with the girl that when she snapped her fingers or something.
Oh no, she would touch
her
fingers together,
right,
like this,
right,
and
time would stop, and then she could restart it, and something about her dad was like in a little cube or something.
Yeah, he was an alien.
Yeah, right.
He was out of this world.
Gotcha. I didn't watch it very often, but that makes total sense. I seem to remember it was right up there with like Small Wonder in terms of quality storytelling and effects.
A little, I would say yes. I think it was a little bit later, but somewhat family friendly.
I also remember she was hot.
She was, I believe, in high school.
I was a kid at the time. She was hot. Maybe she wasn't. I don't remember her. But she might have been blonde. That's probably that's the extent of what I remember. We're going to start a show starting next week. We're going to do a podcast all on the psychology of Out of This World.
That would not be very long.
No. But
so I thought he was freezing everybody around him, like he was the only one in movement. But it turns out that he is almost like the Flash, where the device allows him to, it's sort of the opposite of the Flash. It it suspends his environment, which is still, it's not necessarily frozen. It's that it's slower, and he is at his normal speed, so he feels as though he's faster.
Right. Essentially, we find out later that what this whole thing is, there's a scientist by the name of Dr. Wakati, and he has developed this piece of technology where he has been able to slow everything around them down extraordinarily, so that it's almost like they are completely still. So in this particular case, he's got an iron ball that is falling. And inside this little bubble of time, he has been able to slow down the fall.
The iron ball has dropped a mere 1/10 of a millimeter since the experiment began last week. An extreme temporal discontinuity.
So in other words, we don't even necessarily see it falling, but it is. It's just so slow, we don't acknowledge it.
And the accelerated effect is just as dramatic.
Fugit has positioned himself as Herald, and that is basically Dr. Wakati's Alfred, for lack of a better word. I mean, he's sort of a manservant, butler, assistant, the kind of person who will bring him things if he needs it. And at one point, Dr. Wakati says that he was literally the only person that he trusted. So Wakati is basically a recluse, and he trusts one person only. And what I want to discuss with you, Drea, is something that we discussed in our previous episode, The Clock King, which is that when David Wise, the writer of that episode, said that he basically created the Clock King to be someone with a personality so abrasive that he was inherently unlikable.
Right.
Now you've got him, and he has basically become so likable to this scientist that he's the only person that man trusts. And while I understand that it's all a ruse, because he clearly wants this piece of technology, do human beings have that ability to, like, no, now I'm going to become so likable, and go against my, my usual personality?
Right. Normally, personality is such a long-standing, deeply ingrained set of characteristics that you simply cannot kind of change that. There are different ways in which we might grow or, develop in certain ways, but our personalities are pretty stable.
Because that would require, a great deal of, self... he would have to acknowledge those traits about himself that people don't like.
Well, and I think it's important to think back to the original Clock King, because the writer, as you mentioned, David Wise, had specifically wanted to create this version of the Clock King to be, like you said, not very likable. But what he did was he gave him a very interesting dynamic. He was somebody who, as you can recall, was very conscientious. He was very
You can go ahead and say it. He was anal. He was pretty anal retentive, particularly about schedules and time.
He was, but we discussed how this caused him a couple of things. This caused him to be anxious. It caused him to be very tightly wound. He needed everything to be a certain way. And so, yes, I would say there's an element of perfectionism. There's an element of anxiety. There's an element of, as I said, conscientiousness. And those superficial things were very important to him. Being on time, being very neat, being very organized, being by the book, being rule oriented. When you're very extreme on those characteristics, it can be very off-putting to the humans around you, because we're human. We make mistakes. We are late. We don't always go by the rules. We're a little bit more complex than that. Occasionally, we may we need to be flexible.
Right.
And he didn't have those abilities. He was inflexible. So you say the word anal, I'll use the word inflexible, like very, very rigid.
Let's talk about that rigidity and the lack of flexibility. You had associated that potentially with maybe a disorder, like OCD or even OCPD.
Right. And the distinction, of course, is that the personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, also known as OCPD, is a little bit different than obsessive compulsive disorder, because the personality disorder is a more, again, long-standing, pervasive set of characteristics that's very, 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 very aligned and consistent with a person's whole personality. And those traits that I just talked about are characteristic of that disorder. And when it is a disorder is when it causes impairment, when it keeps somebody from keeping a job, from having relationships. And as we saw, the Clock King was impaired by those aspects of his personality.
Right.
Whereas OCD is an anxiety disorder, or is an anxious compulsive disorder where somebody is in a lot of distress. They're very, they're almost in pain by the amount of anxiety, distress, and discomfort from the rumination, the thoughts, the intrusive ideas, images, and things that they need to counteract with their compulsions and behavior. So actually, I said it's a little bit different, but now that I flesh it out, I should probably say it's a lot different in many ways.
Right. And one could argue that it's possible that Fugit was constantly in pain, or, I mean, at the very least, he was incredibly annoyed by everybody having no, I mean, it was almost, I don't want to say torture, but, he was certainly angered and put off by the lack of respect that other people had for punctuality.
Right. But that level of annoyance or that level of intolerance doesn't mean that he had OCD. In fact, persons with OCPD are more likely to be, somewhat, as I said, off-putting and distancing. And it's possible that people around him, and this is true of that first episode of him, people around him disliked him and were repelled by him and didn't quite get him. And of course, that irritated him. That to me is more of a personality dynamic than anything else. And as we saw, ultimately, that destroyed him, or we believed that destroyed him. Apparently he lived.
6:15, sir. Time for breakfast. I've also brought you your medicine and the timer so you can take your pills on schedule.
He chose an occupation that kind of serves... Do you like that? Do you like the pun?
Yes.
No. It serves him well in that he is able to exercise punctuality. He's able to engage in timeliness and organization. He has to keep this man, on top of his S. So therefore, he's fundamentally, it's part of his job to be super organized and conscientious and on time and all that stuff. So in a way, this kind of allows him to be himself. But you're right, he has to put on some kind of ruse to be, I guess, believable as someone who would just, want to be helpful to this random scientist.
Right. And he ends up taking this equipment out on a joyride where he, ends up going to this auction where Bruce Wayne and Dick are both sort of hanging out. Bruce is bidding on this clock that it's an antique clock that was from the time of Louis the 16th, and Fugit ends up taking it just as the gavel is falling, and that's when they're able to determine that they're not dealing with an invisible rogue.
Then who could it be?
I think it's Temple Fugit, the Clock King.
The rest of this episode is essentially exactly what you would expect if you're dealing with a guy who can seemingly go faster than, sight. It is pretty science fiction-y, I would say it's safe to say.
Absolutely.
And there are some great little points in there. I mean, they're talking about theory of relativity, and they're talking about, I mean, there's a moment where the Batmobile has been booby trapped with one of these devices, and it is moving so slow that everything around it is moving phenomenally quickly, and Batman actually says,
E still equals MC squared, last I heard. Mass increases with speed. If a car hits us while we're frozen like this, we might trigger an atomic explosion.
we can see that they're on the road and that the cars are speeding by. We just see red lights sort of moving past them. But apparently no one in Gotham uses this lane.
No, and from their perspective, wouldn't they see a really, really slow Batmobile? Or one that's just...
Well, it's interesting because, and this is one of those places where I wasn't sure exactly if it would work, but you would think that in their perspective, they should probably feel like they're going at regular speed. But if you were like looking at the Batmobile, if we were out on the street, you know, whatever, and we just saw the Batmobile would seem like it was still.
Right. Because it's moving so much more slowly.
Yeah, it is moving so slowly that we can't even see how quickly it's moving. They should probably feel like they're moving at regular speed.
Of course.
So, but everything around them would be moving so incredibly fast that it would be a blur, which is what we see. But yeah, apparently, you know, for 2 days, the Batmobile's just been sitting there on this lane, you know, probably wreaking havoc on traffic. Gotham probably really dislikes Batman right now. But yeah, they're stuck there for 48 hours.
How do they know they didn't just kind of like stick yellow cones around
They
them?
may have just like, oh, he'll be back. Don't worry. He never leaves this car for very long. But yeah, nobody hit him, which is good. No atomic blasts set off in Gotham due to one car not moving and other cars flying right through it. But yeah, like I really applauded the writer and the animators for playing with that, for playing with real science. That's pretty cool.
Wait. So the other science, the psychological science, wasn't real?
You know, I'm talking about hard science, not soft science. No, of course it's real. But I appreciate that they're playing with other types of science and not just, you know, magic. 'Cause,
Right.
you know, we've been seeing a lot more of that recently. So it's nice that they're playing with the theory of relativity and, you know.
Well, and shortly after that scene, there's one where Batman is able to kind of lock his device onto the bomb that the Clock King sets at
the end, the big climactic moment, yeah.
at the courthouse, and the mayor is giving the speech and is standing right there at the podium, and the bomb is right underneath the podium, and Batman is able to get there in time to attach the device onto the bomb and apparently set it so that he can run with the bomb toward the river.
Right.
And
And
as
the
he's
explosion
running,
is happening so slowly within this bubble that he is not damaged by it. Like it's just sort of budding until he throws it into the river, and then we see the explosion.
Yeah.
Which was kind of cool. Let's talk about why the Clock King, you know, was gunning after Mayor Hill, because really this entire episode sort of boils down to another revenge plot. You know, it's the same, you know, if you remember in the last episode with the Clock King, he was going after Mayor Hill, and he hasn't let that go despite, you know, that old adage. But of course, Batman puts a spin on it.
I doubt that time has healed Fugate's wound.
Clock King is still going after Mayor Hill and presumably Batman at this point. You know, so let's talk about revenge a little bit. I know that this entire series sort of revolves around revenge or vengeance in one way or another. But Drea, is there anything you can talk about when in regard to the Clock King and sort of not letting this go?
Well, I think it's amazing that he has just the links that he's gone through to enact revenge, that he's gotten this job. I mean, this is all to get back at the mayor. He's gotten this job to get closer to the scientist, to obtain this device, in order to manipulate temporal relationships so that he can blow up the courthouse. Like, it's all just so planned. And I mean, first, there are quicker ways to get rid of the mayor or to get revenge.
I don't know. They're not quicker ways. You could see he's going really fast.
Well, sure, but I don't know. There's several months that have passed since he had disappeared, and I think that it's interesting that he has basically lived his life since then, seemingly with this goal to reconnect with the mayor and do so in a way that is vengeful and in a way that's very violent and in a way that's public. He wants something embarrassing, something violent, something very drastic to happen to this man. So those feelings of revenge are very strong. So what's interesting is that while he's planning this revenge, he's perhaps experiencing, I don't know, some kind of thirst or lust for getting this revenge, right? That think about a time where you were thinking of or planning or just kind of reveling in the idea of getting revenge for something that happened to you or someone who betrayed you. Those feelings, they're quite normal, but those feelings can be feelings, urges, like I said, sort of these feelings of thirst, feelings of wanting. Ultimately, the idea there, or the belief there, is that if you get revenge, you'll feel better. And I think this is a psychological assumption that if we get revenge, we will feel better. Closure, right? I'll finally be able to heal from this. I'll walk away. I'll start over. I'll move on. You know, if I don't get revenge, I won't get those feelings. This won't be reconciled. So yeah. But what's interesting is that research shows that we don't feel those feelings of reconciliation and closure when we get revenge. We actually feel the opposite.
I just want to see those studies. It'd be like, hey, so-and-so wronged you. Do you want a chance at revenge? And then you let some people get it and some people not get it. And like, how do you feel about that?
Okay.
Do you feel better or do you just want more? Do you feel satisfied? No? You want to, okay.
Well, initially those studies, and no, they didn't exactly conduct them the way that you're describing, because some of that would be unethical. Like, here's a knife, go for it. The early beliefs, at least from psychological researchers about revenge, is that enacting revenge would lead to some kind of emotional catharsis, that it would lead to closure. But it's interesting because when they looked into the emotions related to revenge, they found the opposite. That, in fact, most of the studies have to do with fake financial benefit and losses. So people set up in groups and they're told to kind of play along with some of these various scenarios. The most cited study is called the free rider experiment, where a group of people would be told if they bet the same amount or put in the same amount of money that everyone would benefit. And of course you have one deflector who doesn't put in the same amount but actually gains more than everyone else. So there's that feeling that everyone gets, that I'm like, that person betrayed me. Then they're given the opportunity to get revenge on that person. And so the people that actually do that report feeling less happy afterwards. They don't report feeling better after enacting revenge. So it's, of course, very simulated, but it shows that the assumption is that someone would feel better, but in fact, they're less happy. And in some circumstances, they're actually even more angry about the situation, even after the revenge.
That's interesting.
The folks that were enacting revenge in that study were called, later they were labeled punishers, like in the write-up of the study, which I thought was funny. And so I'm reading the findings here. Quote, 10 minutes after the game, punishers continued to brood on the free rider significantly more than others did, and increased rumination. that prevented them from moving on, the researchers surmised. So in a way, getting revenge didn't help them get closure. It actually increased their anger and increased rumination, which are kind of repeated thoughts that somebody has that causes them distress.
Is it possible that that's what Batman is going through every time he captures a new criminal? No, granted, he's never caught Joe Chill, but he does nip away a little bit, one at a time, but he just seems to get angrier and angrier. Like, do you think that that's possible?
I think it's absolutely possible in the idea, or in the context of the idea, that if he truly believes that these single events of, accosting these villains and putting them away is going to lead to his happiness, or is going to lead to his feeling closure or feeling emotionally, like we said before, cathartic, like letting these emotions out, it may very well not, because he has sort of relied on this idea, like he has maybe his beliefs are too strong, that those behaviors or those outcomes will lead to that feeling of reconciliation.
Right. And remember, this is something that he basically tells Robin. When Robin's got the opportunity to kill the man responsible for the Flying Grayson's death, and he basically says, look, you're going to feel like this is going to be what you want, and yet I'm telling you right now, it's not going to be what you want.
Yeah, and I think he speaks from experience.
I'm fine.
And one study in the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin in 2002 actually reported higher levels of aggression in people who had supposedly vented their anger than in those who had done nothing at all. So, and of course, that could be a correlation rather than causation, but you have to think about the idea that revenge may, in some ways, facilitate or inspire feelings of anger and rumination, and kind of, keep those wounds open versus allowing them to heal.
Okay, so then that brings me to the question that ultimately, if it doesn't help you, what can you do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because the feeling of betrayal, the feeling of being slighted, and certainly this thirst for, wanting to get back at someone, those are all normal human feelings. I think it would be a disservice to say, just try not to feel that way or try to avoid those feelings. So something that we can do, of course, now knowing that revenge doesn't actually make us feel better, or it doesn't actually make us feel happier, and in many ways could keep those feelings of anger and resentment active, is to think about just that. Just sort of take some time to reflect on how one is feeling because of that betrayal. And there are some tips actually that I pulled from an article from The Observer, which I'll put up a link to it. Some of these tips relate to what we can do when we're feeling like we want to enact revenge. So the first step is sort of what I just said, but be mindful. Practice some mindfulness.
Okay.
Taking a moment to tune into those feelings. So I was betrayed or hurt in some way, and I want to lash out at that person. Take some time to understand, how am I feeling? When did this start? Why is this so hurtful to me? Who is that person to me? And just individually, independently, without interacting with that other person, take a moment to attend to those feelings and thoughts and understand them, and even accept them as part of normal human nature, and accept them as part of who we are and as part of who that person is individually.
Gotcha.
Which is really challenging to tell yourself, I'm feeling really hateful and hurtful right now, but I'm okay with that. I accept that's how I feel.
Right.
Second, understand that if you feel vengeful, it's because there was some trust that was broken or some relationship in conflict. So that may need some reparation that doesn't involve revenge specifically. So think specifically about what that betrayal was, and how there could be a practical, interpersonally respectful way to address that versus revenge.
Okay.
So if it's that, somebody lied to me or somebody kept information from me, and that's hurtful and I want to get revenge on that person, well, maybe I should ask questions. Maybe I should find out the whole picture. Maybe I should bring this up to them and let them know how I'm feeling. And third, just like we brought up today, acknowledge that revenge can make us feel worse, that carrying out revenge brings very little satisfaction and may actually create more problems. In other words, facilitate longer periods of anger and resentment, or even facilitate more conflict if you enact revenge and that person then wants to get revenge on you, and then there's this cycle of back and forth.
Yeah.
So it could create more problems and intensify the conflict. To learn more, you can check out this great article online in The Observer, which is an online magazine for the Association for Psychological Science, APS, and that's The Complicated Psychology of Revenge.
So, Drea, I said that we were dealing with science fiction, but I want to tell you that something really interesting happened a couple of years ago. In 2013, researchers actually stopped light. They physically stopped light for up to 1 full minute.
Wow.
Now, that seems like nothing to us, but when you're talking about stopping light for 1 minute, it's an extraordinarily long amount of time. Now, what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Researchers believe that if they are able to really get into this and stop light for longer, they could eventually figure out how to move faster than the speed of light itself.
Wow.
So this is actually the third time, that was reported that researchers had stopped light. First, it was briefly in 2001. Then earlier in 2013, they had stopped light for 16 seconds. But then in this article published in the Journal of the Physical Review Letters, they actually said that they had stopped light in its tracks, like stopped it dead for 1 solid minute. Now, how did they go about doing this? Well, I'm glad you asked, Drea, because they ended up using a system called electromagnetically induced transparency. Ultimately, what happened was they used a laser and they fired it into a crystal. And after that, a complex quantum level reaction turned the opaque crystal transparent. A second light source was then beamed into the crystal before the control laser was shut off, returning the crystal to its opaque state. This leaves the light trapped inside the crystal, and the opacity of the crystal keeps the light trapped inside from bouncing around, effectively bringing light to a full stop.
Wow.
And it's awesome because basically they're saying that they might even be able to have all kinds of different uses for technology like this going forward. But of course, one of them is transportation faster than the speed of light, which is exactly what Temple Fugit is doing in this episode. So maybe, just maybe, they were watching an episode of Batman the Animated Series or The Adventures of Batman and Robin, as the case may be, and they were like, you know what? Much like Star Trek, it's time we start working on things like this.
This isn't the first time. This, I certainly don't attribute some of these scientific findings and discoveries based on the animated series, but the animated series had the Oculus Rift, and the Riddler had Skype, and all these like cool things that we have now that they had to invent in the show.
Yeah.
So it's I know that theoretically those things were around, but it's very cool to kind of see that the different storylines can have a little bit more truth now.
Yeah. For all we know, someone is running around this room right now just listening to our podcast. We would seem very boring to that person right this second, but we don't know. That person could have this little device right now.
You're creeping me out.
I know. Well, that being said, I thought this episode was fun. It was a lot of fun to revisit the Clock King, to see a character who's so driven with revenge. I mean, you talk about the amount of time that this guy has been focused on revenge. If you remember, after his company, after his complete career came to a complete stop, due to Hamilton Hill before he was mayor, when he was an attorney. Then took, if I remember correctly, 7 years before the Clock King reemerged to seek his revenge. Now we're talking about, I mean, that was like episode 25 for us. And now we're talking about episode 73. This guy has been living off of revenge for, 8 or 9 years at this point. So it's interesting to go back and revisit him and to see just how single-minded he is, and I look forward to maybe the possibility of being able to do it again. In this particular episode, he was arrested, so that's something that's progress. He was never arrested after the first episode.
He could be back. Well, what's interesting psychologically is that he has yet to enact revenge, so he has yet to learn that experiencing revenge actually doesn't lead to much more happiness and contentment.
Right.
So he may very well try again.
Yeah. Well, until he tries again, or at the very least, until next week when we come back with a brand new episode, Drea, where can folks find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc. My website is underthemaskonline.com.
And you can find me on Twitter. I am at bward028. You should definitely follow us on Twitter. We both man the Arkham Sessions Twitter account. That is at Arkham Sessions. You can email all of your questions and comments and cool articles about sciencey stuff to arkhamsessions@gmail.com. And you should definitely follow our family over at fanboycomics.net. You can also find them on Twitter. They are at Fanboy Comics. On Twitter, comics is spelled with an X. Until next week, I am Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And together we are
The Arkham Sessions.
Looks like time just ran out.